In today's video, we'll be exploring a niche favourite amongst aviation fans, though it wasn't particularly flashy, high-performing, or even built in particularly large numbers, and that was the Arado Ar-196. As a naval reconnaissance aircraft, the Arado, like others of its type, is often overshadowed by other, more aggressive designs that fought the numerous aerial battles of the Second World War. But the 196 still fulfilled an important role, and it established itself as a reliable workhorse, coming to be known as the eyes of the Kriegsmarine. Today's video is also very kindly sponsored by Icarus Art, who produce some wonderful aviation-themed canvas prints and posters, and among their products are a couple of examples of the AR-196. One depicts a peaceful scene of an AR-196 tied up to its mooring on an Austrian lake, and the other has a more balmy tone, with the aircraft flying low over crystal clear waters on a patrol. Of course, there are numerous other prints and posters available as well, and Icarus are always adding new pieces to their inventory. They also provide their art in a range of sizes, so you can have a modest piece for your office, or perhaps a huge 40-inch print for your living room. So to check out their collection, click on the link below, or go to icarusart.net, and use the code REX to get a 10% discount on your order. Now, looking at the Arado, the roots of the 196's development stretch back to March of 1935, when the German Ministry of Aviation, the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, issued a request for a new ship-launched Scout to replace the aging Heinkel HE-60. Despite being powered by a 660 horsepower BMW V1 inline engine, the aircraft suffered from poor speed. In no way a disservice to the fairly powerful BMW engine, but rather a reflection that the airframe was simply overbuilt. Weighing in at 2.8 tons empty, it was heavier than the gross weight of many of its contemporaries, such as the Curtiss SOC Seagull. This gave the HE-60 very average speed, very sluggish handling, and a very poor load capacity. In fact, all the HE-60 could realistically get into the air was its observer, who would often remove the rear-facing machine gun to save weight. Pacifying your aircraft's defensive capabilities just to get it airborne was not exactly an ideal situation, and it was clear that a replacement was needed. Heinkel and Arado both proposed designs, both of which impressed officials, and both were granted development contracts. The Arado AR-95 and the Heinkel HE-114 were the fruits of said development, and they actually shared quite a lot in common. Both went with the twin-float layout, both were powered by the same BMW 132 radial engine, and both were built along similar lines. In the end, the RLM began to show preference for the Heinkel design, and Arado was advised to redesign the AR-95 into a universal naval aircraft for export. It was required to have the aircraft designed so that it could be flown with either floats or a regular undercarriage, and it was to have enough space to accommodate a third crew member if needed. The AR-95 took to the skies for the first time on December 6, 1936, and ultimately only a small number were built. Despite this, the AR-95 would actually see service in the Second World War, and it continued to serve in the Eastern Front until 1944. The designer of the AR-95, Walter Blum, a World War I flying ace, had been unhappy with the direction that the AR-95 took, and the fact that it lost out to the Heinkel HE-114. And during 1936, he continued work on improving the overall design. He eventually ended up with a smaller and lighter low-wing monoplane, which he submitted on the 12th of August 1936. To which 24 representatives of the RLM would come to Warnemünde 3 weeks later to inspect a mock-up of the proposed design. The HE-114, in the meantime, was quickly losing favour, as it became clear it was hardly an upgrade over the HE-60 it was intended to replace. Indeed, most ships equipped with the HE-60 never even received their HE-114s. Written around the new Arado design, a fresh requirement was issued to the aircraft industry by the RLM in October, to which 3 new aircraft were proposed. A floatplane variant of the Gotha 145 trainer and the Dornier Do-22 were immediately rejected, the 145 being unfit for combat duty, and the Do-22 being simply too large for shipboard use. Focke-Wulf came up with an all-new design, the Focke-Wulf 62 biplane, which was selected for development, along with Bloom's AR-196 monoplane. Both aircraft were ordered in 2 prototype variants, 2 with twin floats, and 2 with a single central float and twin outrigger floats. It was believed that the latter could have advantages with landing in rough seas, by absorbing the impact into the fuselage and not the wings, but there were concerns about stability, hence the 2 design variants being required. The first AR-196 prototype, with twin floats, flew on the 1st of June 1937, and it was found to have favourable characteristics in the water and in the air, along with surprising manoeuvrability. The Focke-Wulf 62, obviously at a disadvantage to the more modern AR-196, didn't fly until October of the same year, though it too was found that, despite its conservative design philosophy, the aircraft was stable, good to fly, and a competent platform for shipboard use. Despite its good qualities, the Focke-Wulf 62 lost the contract due to its older style biplane layout, and its mixed fabric construction, both of which made it more difficult to manufacture and heavier, and made it more vulnerable to wear and tear at sea. The 196, by contrast, was thoroughly modern with its monocoque construction, and was of course a monoplane. The aircraft's fuselage was constructed on a frame of welded steel tubing, with duraluminium sheets covering the front section of the aircraft, that were riveted or bolted onto the internal frame, and the middle and the rear aircraft was still fabric covered. The 196 was 11 metres, or 36 feet in length, 12.4 metres, or 40 feet 8 inches in span, and 4.45 metres, or 14 feet 7 inches in height. Its wings, being foldable at the base, also allowed the 196 to hugely reduce its required hangar space, which was a big advantage. November 1938 saw the first tests with the outrigger float combination, but it did not seem to confirm the theoretical advantages the RLM had presumed. The central float did allow slightly better landing performance, though it was judged that this was outweighed by its inferior manoeuvrability and stability whilst taxiing. In testing, the maximum speed of the aircraft was much better than its contemporaries, at 315 km an hour for most of the A series, though it was increased to 332 km an hour, or 206 miles an hour with the A5. The range, too, of 1,080 kilometers, or 580 nautical miles, allowed a fairly large circle of operation from the ship it was launched from, and the endurance was upwards of 3 hours, provided that the pilots went easy on the throttle. 20th July 1939 saw the first of the 20 AR-196A1s being delivered for service testing. Being armed with only a single 7.92mm MG-15 for the Observer, they weren't exactly the most heavily defended aircraft of the year, though they were equipped with racks that could carry up to 2 50kg bombs. These early 196s were powered with 880 horsepower BMW 132K radial engines with 3-bladed Schwartz propellers. As was intended, the service tests highlighted several issues with the design. One of the prototypes suffered an engine mount collapse, which had come loose after the crew had attempted to put it down during rough water handling trials. The aircraft survived the landing, but upon trying to take off again, the AR-196 hit a swell which jolted the engine completely free of its bearings, falling into a fuel line on the central float and igniting a fire. Both the pilot and the observer managed to bail out from the burning airframe, and the cold waters quickly smothered the flames. But self-evacuating engines were not ideal, in any situation really, and this serious issue led to the development of the improved A-2, which had some significant structural improvements, was equipped with 2 20mm MG-FF cannons in the wings, and a 7.92mm MG-17 machine gun in the cowling, and an uprated BMW 132K engine, now capable of outputting 960 horsepower under takeoff. The A3, coming after the misnumbered A4, saw enlarged fuel tanks in the pontoons and further strengthening of the structure again. The A5 model, being the final production model from 1943 onwards, fitted MGFF/M cannons with extended magazines, additional armour plating for the crew, and an uprated BMW 132W engine. MG-81Z defensive machine guns were retrofitted to many existing 196 models to increase defensive firepower, though they came as standard on all of the A5s. 15mm MG-151s or 131 guns were also fitted or retrofitted to the 196s later on in the war, replacing the old MGFF in favour of more modern weaponry. The Arado itself began full-scale production in mid-1939, with the first production batch of A1s equipping ships and reconnaissance squadrons later the same year. Two notable early encounters during the Second World War involved the 196 taking on British submarines, with the capture of HMS Seal in May of 1940 and the sinking of HMS Shark in July. This second action took place during the night of the 4th and 5th of July 1940, when two Arados from 5 Bordflieger Group, and apologies if that's been butchered, came across the unsuspecting HMS Shark off the coast of Norway. The aircraft spotted the surfaced submarine at a range of just 1 kilometre from their position, and so quickly climbed up to mount a suitable attack. Both the 196s then dived, nearly vertically, at the submarine, no fire returning from the unaware crew, and the German pilots released their bombs, detonating near the stern. The bombs did significant damage, whilst the Arados continued mounting their attack, strafing the crippled submarine, which was now unable to dive. Both Arados actually completely emptied their ammunition, returned to base and rearmed, and then headed back to continue their attack. It was 1 AM by the time they returned, and they had been joined by 2 DO-18s and 4 BF-109s. By this point, the crew of the submarine were, funnily enough, aware of the threat, and determinedly returned fire despite taking several casualties themselves, inflicting damage on both the 196s and 1 DO-18. Finally, the British crew was forced to raise a white flag and surrender, prompting one of the AR-196s to land next to the submarine. The crew hadn't realised that one of the pontoons had been hit in the flight, and the AR-196 sank shortly after landing. A DO-18 then picked up both of the German crew members, along with 2 British officers, and a nearby German trawler picked up the rest of the surviving crew from the submarine. Barely a month later, the AR-196 would have perhaps its most famous combat experience of the war, when on August the 15th, 1940, during the Battle of Britain, a single AR-196 encountered a situation that would have made any pilot blanch, as it was bounced by no less than 10 Spitfires on a patrol over the Channel. During the extremely one-sided fight that ensued, the German seaplane actually managed to shoot down one Spitfire and severely damaged another, before going down itself, obviously. The pilot, Staffelkapitän Hauptmann Gerrit Weigmink, and I again apologise if that's pronounced wrong, survived the crash, though the observer had already been killed during the dogfight, and this engagement became a prime example of the AR-196's uncanny ability to fight in a context far beyond its weight class, especially when in the hands of a competent pilot. Now, a lot of this was thanks to its relatively heavy armament, which included 20mm cannons, something which wasn't found too often in aircraft of this type. In maritime service, the 196 operated as a mainstay reconnaissance aircraft in both the Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine, serving aboard ships such as the Bismarck, Tirpitz, and Scharnhorst. 2 also operated aboard Thor and Mikkel, operated in Malaya under Japanese control in 1940. These Arados were operated by German crews, but in Japanese markings. Many 196s operated from land bases, though its unique capabilities made it an invaluable and the most advanced aircraft capable of being launched via catapult in the German military during the war. The first Arado put to sea was aboard the Admiral Graf Spee, giving the battlecruiser a 500-kilometer circle of visibility. 196s found the majority of the 11 British victims of the Graf Spee, and then the Bismarck carried 4 Arados in the double hangar under the mainmast, and in 2 single hangars to both sides of the funnel amidships. The battleship did have the hangar space to house 6 in total if necessary. The telescopically extendable double catapults could be extended perpendicular to the length of the ship, at either side, and after a mission, the 12-ton crane would be necessary to lift the floatplane back aboard, providing the aircraft had survived the landing, of course. This was a serious consideration, as conditions far out in the Atlantic tended to get pretty rough, and that can easily damage or destroy a floatplane upon landing, no matter how much effort has been put into its construction. This was often remedied by having the aircraft land in the wake of the ship, where the waves tended to be far more calm. The stresses of catapult launches also were not without risk. After some serious structural shortcomings became clear, which involved the rapid disassembly of several airframes as they plummeted into the sea, the Kriegsmarine banned all of the A2 models from said catapult launches, and they were either refitted and brought up to the A3 standard or entirely replaced. It's also worth noting that at the beginning, there was quite a low opinion of the AR-196 when they first entered service. The crews who operated them often resented having to give up their old HE-60s, which were, as a result of being overbuilt, far more rugged than the lightweight Arado. Nevertheless, the general opinion shifted as the aircraft went through its development cycle, and the kinks were gradually ironed out. By the mid-war period, and from the A3 model onward, opinions of the 196 had grown very high indeed, with pilots often citing excellent maneuverability and combat effectiveness, something not really expected of a shipboard reconnaissance seaplane. In fact, when compared with its contemporaries, there is little discussion to be had in regards to which one was the best. Whether compared to the Supermarine Walrus, the OS2U Kingfisher, or the Aichi E-13A, the Arado was by far the most capable, the highest performing, and by far and away the best armed of its class. A statement that I'm sure will trigger much debate, but that is just my own opinion, of course. Despite this, the march of development during the war obviously left the 196 obsolescence by the end. On March the 24th, 1945, an Arado of 2 Bordfliegergruppe was shot down by Soviet ground fire, giving it the distinction of being the last AR-196 to be lost in combat during the war, and 1 Bordfliegergruppe had the distinction of being the last Luftwaffe squadron to actually operate the aircraft. Aside from German service, the Arado also saw a fair amount of export use, with Bulgaria, Finland, and Romania operating them. Bulgaria ordered 9 A3 models in 1943, used by the 161 Yato unit, and operated them on the Eastern Front in conjunction with the Luftwaffe. Bulgarian crews nicknamed the aircraft the Akula, or Shark, and it stayed in service supporting the Bulgarian fishing fleet until 1956, when a total lack of spare parts forced them into retirement. Romania only received 2 examples before the invasion of the Soviet Union, both of which were swiftly confiscated and put into service with the Soviet Border Guard. And Finland only operated a number of Arados as well, all operating with Lenturik Menti 5, again pronunciation is probably way off. These Finnish aircraft were the A3 models, which were later upgraded to A5 spec, and were used throughout the Continuation War until the armistice in late 1944. A number of Arados were also captured and put into service throughout the war, with Norway, Greece, and the aforementioned Soviet Union all having various aircraft fall into their hands and putting them into service. 4 Arados were delivered aboard the Admiral Hipper when the Soviets purchased it, during the German-Soviet period of non-aggression, so as to allow Soviet crews to gain experience with German catapult systems. On the 22nd of June 1941, they were recaptured by the Germans aboard the Soviet timber freighter Vogeles, and during 1944 and 1945, the Soviet Union would capture multiple Arados along the Baltic coast of Poland and Germany, along with spare parts from a depot at Dachau. After repairs, 37 Soviet AR-196s went into service with the Soviet Border Guard, where they served until 1955. Some of these aircraft were also refitted with the M621R Soviet-built radial engine to make servicing easier, and the last in service were retired in 1955 and 1956 by the Soviet Union and Bulgaria respectively, allowing by this time the antiquated aircraft to finally end its official service life overseas. Retired less than 10 years after its first flight, at least in German service anyway, the AR-196 was certainly a product of its time, one where aircraft technology was progressing at light speed, but before helicopters were developed enough to replace them in roles such as one occupied by the Arado itself. Often remembered as having the distinction of being the last combat floatplane built in Europe, the 196 was a well-liked, consistent, and reliable aircraft, and one that has a long-lasting legacy amongst aviation enthusiasts. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and a big thank you, of course, to the patrons. Things have been a bit quiet on the channel because I've been working on some personal projects, not channel related at all actually, so if it seems I've been a bit quiet this past fortnight, that is why. Oh, the joys of balancing work and life. A big thank you, of course, to our Wing Commander tier patrons, our highest tier supporters, and this is going to sound really bad, but I already miss summer. I've been living in Australia for far too long, and as I record this, I'm actually wearing a hoodie, so please send help. But as always, thank you all so much for your continued support, and I will catch you all next time. Goodbye.